This is the latest in a series of videos from a Thelemic philosophical, magical perspective, interpreting and approaching various books that are of interest. Today, we're going to talk about The Star in the West, a critical essay upon the works of Aleister Crowley by John Frederick Charles Boney Fuller, or just J.F.C. Fuller. I last read this book over 20 years ago and was pleasantly surprised that it was not nearly as tedious as I remembered. It is in places overwritten, although I detect an element of British irony behind its excess of style that is perhaps missed by some readers. This remark applies to Crowley's writings as well. It does seem to me that the author exhibits the symptoms of an unhealthy transference relationship towards his object of hero worship, and therefore also of father projection, both in a potentially positive but perhaps more negative sense as well. Fuller's enthusiasm may lack seasoning, however, it also makes him a careful and thorough reader of Crowley's complicated early texts, and these qualities rescue his book from the category of crank literature. The Star in the West is a summary and evaluation of the spiritual and philosophical argument implicit to Aleister Crowley's writings included in the 1905-7 three-volume collected works, which excludes the Book of the Law. Fuller subsequently convinced Crowley to rehabilitate Liber L, and he is therefore, in a sense, the first Thelemite. Certainly he was Crowley's first serious magical student and intellectual collaborator, hence the value of this summary text for the student of the genealogical sources of Thelema. This book was written during the initial stages of the creation of Crowley's magical teaching order, the AA. Fuller was its first cancellarius and served for a time as the Grand Neophyte. A few years before the order's role as a vehicle for the Thelemic current was made explicit, The Star in the West therefore provides a schematic overview of most of the themes and concepts that together will eventually form the basis of Thelema, here instead named Crowleyanity, I think half jokingly, and described as a scientific illuminism achieved through the practice of Pyrrhic Zoroastrianism, otherwise to be translated skeptical theurgy. These conceptions correlate with and help provide further background for the official methodology announced by the motto of the Equinox, which began publication in 1909. The method of science, the aim of religion. Although Fuller is not Crowley, and his interpretations of what he thought Crowley was up to should not be treated as final, or even as particularly authoritative, they nevertheless give insight into the intellectual context the modernist avant-garde scene surrounding Crowley during the time he was developing the AA system of magic. Fuller is keen to settle the score with modern Western philosophy, running roughly from René Descartes to T.H. Huxley, which he reads as culminating in the ambiguous yet also positive triumph of a secularizing skepticism. Fuller and Crowley are not anti-modern traditionalists. They are for the Enlightenment even while recognizing its limits. For example, their use of the term agnosticism, contextually derived from Thomas Huxley and Herbert Spencer, refers somewhat broadly to the overthrow of Christian hegemony by the enlightened skepticism of modern philosophy. This leads in turn to a cultural clearing of the decks, opening the path for a fresh approach to the problem of the meaning of human existence in terms of a creative, ecstatic inspiration derived from the practice of magic and mysticism. Fuller writes, quote, "Thus reason ends by whispering, 'I am agnostic. I cannot answer yea or nay.' This is the crowning triumph of the 19th century." And now the Vega of Illuminism. The flashing star of Crowleyanity drowns the sun of agnosticism and reduces the whole infinite ether to a flaming crown of glory. Unquote. Yet it is not clear what this glory amounts to, as Fuller's imagery goes fuzzy with enthusiasm. To declare that the attainment of ecstasy is its own end remains abstract and formal. What is the acolyte of Crowleyanity practically doing? when empowered through their ecstasy. If the poetic imagination can be illuminated, what about the illumination of the will? I would argue that the meandering argument of the star in the west culminates in a hermeneutical prehension. It formulates a question to which Thelema provides the answer. Indeed, in Crowley's mature writings, he moves away from the use of the term agnosticism to describe his methodology and instead emphasizes a pragmatic method influenced by William James' The Varieties of Religious Experience from 1902, thereby shifting focus from belief to action. I have some other minor criticisms of the Star in the West. Fuller's advocacy of free love is underdeveloped, and he criticizes Christian norms towards marriage while preserving other bourgeois biases regarding what counts as virtue and vice. Therefore, while he claims that, quote, the path of vice we must tread before we can find the high road of virtue, and vice we must wed before we can open the gates of a more perfect understanding, unquote. This is a transition that does not substantially alter his pre-initiatory vulgar assumptions regarding which is which. Hence the deployment in the opening chapters of the usual set of Victorian pre-feminist tropes of the virgin, the woman standing around waiting to get fucked, the mother, the woman fulfilled by getting fucked, and the ever-threatening harlot, the woman whose sexuality lies ambiguously outside of full male control, and whose sexuality is therefore to be brought back under patriarchal oversight by being commodified as prostitution. Fuller also seems oddly oblivious to the homosexual valences of Crowley's poetic diction, treating these themes in purely metaphorical terms. This would unfortunately lead to conflict between the two men later, as Fuller's heteronormative prejudices clashed with Crowley's more liberated sexuality. Finally, Fuller's interpretation of the Kabbalistic zero is imprecise, and he misses the deeper and more radical implications of this central concept in Crowley's ontology that differentiate Thelema, and also Buddhism, from other more traditionally supernatural positivist spiritualities. For example, the influence of the Hegelian dialectic on Crowley's formulation of the Kabbalistic zero is acknowledged, only to get lost again as Fuller lapses into vague and tiresome rhapsodizing about a something which reason alone cannot grasp. Thelemic philosophy had to start somewhere. But today I think we can do a much better job engaging in constructive conversation with modern philosophy, including but not being limited to the kinds of skepticism deployed in this fascinating yet ultimately provisional text.